The Galactic Council's declaration sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The ice caves of Zyros 7, once considered a potential frontier for human expansion, were now officially off-limits. The report was definitive. Extreme cold, unpredictable seismic shifts, and dangerously low oxygen levels made survival impossible. No colony could be sustained there. No outpost could endure. The caves were dead zones, beautiful in their crystalline formations, treacherous in every other way. The findings came after years of research, funded by interstellar agencies eager to push the boundaries of human habitation. Probes had mapped the tunnels with precision. Drones had measured atmospheric conditions, and autonomous life support units had been deployed to test long-term viability. All failed. Some collapsed under shifting ice. Others froze beyond function. A few simply vanished, swallowed by unseen fissures in the frozen rock. When the final verdict was released, it was met with both relief and frustration. Relief from those who feared another costly expedition ending in tragedy. Frustration from those who saw potential in the unknown. The caves remained unexplored in depth, their secrets buried beneath layers of ice and time. But the Council had spoken. No further funding would be allocated. No missions would be approved. The ice caves of Zyros 7 were closed to humanity. Across the galaxy, the decision was accepted as fact. Scientists moved on to more viable worlds. Governments redirected resources elsewhere. Media coverage faded within weeks. The ice caves became a footnote in planetary exploration, a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding reality. But not everyone agreed. Among the countless readers of the report, one man saw something different. Not a warning, but a challenge. Elias Rourke had spent his life defying limits. He wasn't a scientist or an astronaut. He was a survivalist, a lone explorer who thrived where others perished. His name wasn't known in mainstream circles, but among independent explorers, he was legend. He had crossed methane deserts without filtration suits, survived radiation storms with nothing but a shielded shelter, endured isolation in places no one else dared enter. To him, the Council's findings weren't proof of impossibility. They were data points, constraints to be worked around. If the caves were truly uninhabitable, then why did they still exist? Why did they still hold mystery? And if technology couldn't survive them, maybe the answer wasn't better machines, but better humans. Elias didn't believe in invincible environments. He believed in adaptation, in ingenuity, in the ability of a single person to push past what institutions deemed impossible. He knew the risks. He understood the dangers. But he also knew that sometimes the only way to prove something could be done was to do it. So he made a choice. He wouldn't wait for approval. He wouldn't seek permission. He wouldn't bring unnecessary gear or rely on automated systems that had already failed. He would go alone, with only what he could carry and what the caves themselves provided. His plan was simple. Enter the ice caves. Build a shelter using primitive methods. Survive long enough to prove the Council wrong. Not with words. Not with theory. With action. He gathered what he needed. A multi-purpose blade, thermal blankets, emergency rations, and a small power cell for limited heating. That was all. No external communication devices. No drones. No support teams. Just him. As he prepared, he studied everything available on the ice caves. Every probe scan, every environmental reading, every recorded failure. He learned where temperatures dropped lowest, where oxygen thinned most unpredictably, where seismic activity posed the greatest risk. He memorized patterns, identified stable zones, and planned his route with meticulous care. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew the caves could kill him, but he also knew that fear was just another obstacle to overcome. On the day of departure, he stood at the edge of Zyros 7's frozen surface, staring down into the yawning mouth of the ice caves. The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying fine particles of ice that glittered like stars in the dim light of the distant sun. It was beautiful. It was deadly. He took a deep breath, adjusted his pack, and stepped forward. The entrance swallowed him whole. Inside, the world changed instantly. The wind disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the soft crunch of his boots against the ice. The walls shimmered in the glow of his helmet light, reflecting back in distorted waves. The air was thin, sharp with cold, but breathable for now. He moved carefully, deliberately, each step taking him deeper into the unknown. He felt the weight of solitude settle over him immediately. There was no turning back. No one watching. No one waiting. Just him in the cave. He pressed on. Hours passed. Then days. He marked his progress mentally, tracking time by the rhythm of his own body. He found pockets of denser ice, tested their stability, and selected a location for his first shelter. Using his blade, he carved into the snow, shaping a rough dome. He lined the interior with fibrous ice crystals he discovered clinging to the walls, insulating material that helped retain heat. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Each night, he refined his techniques, adjusted his routines, learned to move efficiently, conserve energy, and anticipate changes in temperature and pressure. He rationed food carefully, supplementing his supply with bioluminescent fungi he found growing along the walls. He melted ice for water, collected condensation for minerals. He adapted, and with each passing day, he proved something undeniable. Survival was possible, not because of technology, not because of luck, because of human will. By the end of the first week, he had established a rhythm, a routine, a sense of control over his environment. He had built a home in the heart of the ice caves, a place where the council had declared no human could last. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And somewhere above, in the vast expanse of space, the Galactic Council continued its work, unaware that a single man had already rewritten the rules. Because sometimes, the only way to change the future is to walk into the unknown and refuse to turn back. That was exactly what Elias Rourke intended to do. Elias Rourke had always lived on the edge of what others called impossible. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege, nor did he chase fame or fortune. His name was known only in certain circles: explorers, survivalists, and those who understood that the real frontier wasn't in politics or commerce, but in the raw, unfiltered unknown. He had spent his life testing limits, not for recognition, but because he believed something fundamental about human nature. People were meant to explore, to endure, to push beyond what was deemed safe. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a problem solver. And the ice caves of Zyros, 7 were the kind of problem he couldn't ignore. The Galactic Council had declared them uninhabitable based on data: cold too extreme, oxygen too thin, seismic activity too unpredictable. But Elias knew data could be misleading. It showed averages, trends, probabilities. It didn't account for adaptation, improvisation, or the will to survive. Machines failed in extreme conditions because they couldn't think. Humans could. That belief had carried him through some of the most hostile environments ever recorded. On the Los 4, he had crossed a methane desert without a filtration suit, using pressure-sealed breathing techniques learned from deep-sea divers centuries ago. On Epsilon Draconis, he had survived weeks inside a radiation storm by constructing a makeshift shield from scrap metal and ionized minerals. Each experience taught him something new, not just about survival, but about the mind's ability to adapt when pushed past its limits. The ice caves were different, not because they were more dangerous. Every place he had explored had its own unique risks, but because no one had ever truly tested their boundaries. Probes had mapped the tunnels, drones had measured temperature gradients, and autonomous shelters had been deployed, only to fail within days. But machines weren't alive. They couldn't adjust, couldn't learn. If the caves were deadly, it was only because no one had yet figured out how to live within them. Elias studied every report available. He memorized oxygen levels at different depths, analyzed thermal readings, traced seismic patterns. He noted where failures had occurred and why. Shelters crushed by shifting ice, power cells drained by extreme cold, oxygen scrubbers overwhelmed by fluctuating atmospheric pressure. Every failure told a story, and Elias listened carefully. He knew he couldn't rely on technology. The Galactic Council had already proven that standard survival gear wouldn't last. Instead, he focused on simplicity. His plan was minimalist. Enter the caves with only what he could carry, build shelter using materials found inside, and sustain himself long enough to prove that survival was possible. No external support, no automated systems, no emergency extraction. Just him, His pack contained only essentials: thermal blankets, a multi-purpose blade, emergency rations, and a small power cell for limited heating. He would need to ration food carefully, relying on whatever the caves provided. He would need to regulate body heat, without dependence on failing tech. He would need to move efficiently, conserve energy, and remain alert to changes in the environment. Every decision mattered. As he prepared, he reviewed everything he had learned. He trained his body to function with less sleep, practiced controlled breathing to conserve oxygen, and rehearsed emergency procedures in case of cave-ins or sudden temperature drops. He knew that once he entered the ice caves, there would be no second chances. There would only be action, reaction, and the relentless pursuit of survival. When the time came, he stood alone at the entrance of the cave, staring into the darkness below. The wind howled across the frozen surface of Zyro 7, carrying fine particles of ice that glittered like distant stars. He adjusted his pack, took a final breath of thin, frigid air, and stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world changed. The wind disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the soft crunch of his boots against the ice. The walls shimmered under his helmet light, reflecting back in distorted waves. The air was sharp with cold, thin but breathable. For now, he moved carefully, deliberately. Every step was calculated. He scanned the terrain, searching for stable ground, potential shelter sites, signs of environmental hazards. He felt the weight of solitude settle over him immediately. There was no turning back, no one watching, no one waiting, just him in the cave. He pressed on. Hours passed, then days. He marked his progress mentally, tracking time by the rhythm of his own body. He found pockets of denser ice, tested their stability, and selected a location for his first shelter. Using his blade, he carved into the snow, shaping a rough dome. He lined the interior with fibrous ice crystals he discovered clinging to the walls, insulating material that helped retain heat. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Each night, he refined his techniques, adjusted his routines, learned to move efficiently, conserve energy, and anticipate changes in temperature and pressure. He rationed food carefully, supplementing his supply with bioluminescent fungi he found growing along the walls. He melted ice for water, collected condensation for minerals. He adapted, and with each passing day, he proved something undeniable. Survival was possible, not because of technology, not because of luck, because of human will. By the end of the first week, he had established a rhythm, a routine, a sense of control over his environment. He had built a home in the heart of the ice caves, a place where the council had declared no human could last. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And somewhere above in the vast expanse of space, the Galactic Council continued its work, unaware that a single man had already rewritten the rules. Because sometimes, the only way to change the future is to walk into the unknown and refuse to turn back. That was exactly what Elias Rourke intended to do. The cold was relentless. It didn't just surround Elias, it pressed in on him, seeping through every layer of fabric, every exposed patch of skin, every breath he took. It wasn't the sharp sting of wind or the biting edge of a snowstorm. It was deeper than that. It was a kind of cold that felt like time itself had frozen, slow and patient, waiting for weakness to show. He moved carefully, conserving energy with each step. Every motion had to be deliberate. He knew from experience that survival wasn't about brute force or sheer endurance. It was about efficiency. Waste too much heat, expend too much energy, and even the strongest mind couldn't compensate. His shelter stood behind him, a rough dome carved into the ice wall, lined with fibrous crystals that helped trap warmth. It wasn't much, just enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. But it was his. He stepped inside, pulling his thermal blanket tighter around his shoulders. The interior was dimly lit by the soft glow of his helmet light, casting long shadows across the uneven walls. He sat down slowly, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of heat he had managed to preserve. His body ached. His fingers were numb despite the gloves. His muscles burned from exertion, but he forced himself to stay alert. Rest came later. First, he needed to stabilize. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small slab of ice. With practiced precision, He placed it near the center of the shelter, positioning it so that the minimal heat from his power cell would begin to melt it. Water was essential, and here it had to be earned, one drop at a time. While the ice softened, he examined his rations. Emergency food bars, designed for short-term survival missions. High in calories, dense in nutrients, but limited in quantity. He had calculated how far they would take him, and the numbers weren't comforting. He had planned for this. If he wanted to last more than a week, he would need to find sustenance within the cave itself. He turned his attention to the bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls. They glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing with an eerie blue-green light. He had tested them before, cautiously tasting small amounts over the past few days. They weren't pleasant, bitter, almost metallic, but they were edible. More importantly, they contained trace proteins and carbohydrates, enough to supplement his dwindling supplies. He scraped a few clusters from the wall, placing them carefully on a strip of fabric. Later, he would dry them, reducing their moisture content to make them easier to store. For now, he needed immediate fuel. He chewed slowly, letting the bitter taste settle on his tongue before swallowing. As the melted water pooled in a small container, Elias wiped condensation from the inner walls of the shelter. The air was thin, but not entirely devoid of moisture. Over time, tiny droplets formed on the ice surfaces, drawn out by temperature differences between the shelter's interior and the surrounding environment. He collected what he could, adding it to his water supply. Survival wasn't just about food and warmth. It was about maintaining the body's core functions. Dehydration slowed reaction times, dulled the senses, made everything harder. He had learned that lesson the hard way once before, on Epsilon Draconis, where a single mistake had nearly cost him his life. Since then, he had never underestimated the importance of hydration. With his immediate needs addressed, Elias turned his focus outward. The ice caves were vast, stretching deep beneath the surface of Zyros 7. He had explored only a fraction of them, sticking close to his shelter as he established routines and tested his survival methods. But if he wanted to prove the Galactic Council wrong, if he wanted to push beyond what others had deemed impossible, he needed to move further, gather more data, understand the cave system better. He adjusted his gear, ensuring his blade was secure and his thermal blanket was properly fastened. He checked his oxygen levels, noting the gradual decline in certain areas. The caves weren't uniform in atmosphere. Some sections held breathable air, while others became dangerously thin. He had mapped these variations mentally, marking safe zones and avoiding areas where oxygen dropped below critical thresholds. Stepping back into the cold, he moved with purpose. Each step left a faint imprint in the ice, soon swallowed by the shifting frost. He followed the tunnel ahead, watching for signs of instability. Fractures in the walls, unusual sounds, subtle shifts in pressure. The caves were alive in their own way, constantly shifting, reshaping themselves with the slow inevitability of geological time. He found a new chamber deeper in the tunnels, its ceiling arched and smooth, free of recent collapse. The walls shimmered with crystalline formations, reflecting his light in distorted patterns. He ran his gloved hand along the surface, testing for stability. This place could serve as a secondary shelter, if needed, a backup in case his primary location became compromised. He marked the spot mentally, noting its position relative to his main shelter. Navigation was crucial. Without clear reference points, it was easy to become disoriented in the endless corridors of ice. He used natural features to guide him. Distinct rock formations, recurring patterns in the ice, subtle changes in temperature and airflow. By the time he returned to his shelter, hours had passed. His body was exhausted, his fingers stiff, his vision slightly blurred from fatigue. He allowed himself a moment to sit, to breathe, to let the weight of the day settle. Then, methodically, he recorded his observations in a journal etched onto thin sheets of salvaged metal. Each entry detailed his findings: oxygen fluctuations, temperature gradients, structural weaknesses, resource availability. It wasn't just for his own benefit. Somewhere, someday, someone else might read these notes. Someone might build upon what he had done, expand upon his discoveries. That was the point, not just to survive, but to learn, to adapt, to push forward. He secured the journal inside his pack, then wrapped himself tightly in the thermal blanket. Sleep was necessary, but dangerous. In environments like this, the body cooled rapidly during unconsciousness, making prolonged rest risky. He set a timer on his wrist display, 45 minutes. Enough to recover without losing too much heat. As he closed his eyes, he thought about the world above, the distant sun, the frozen plains of Zyro 7, the bureaucratic halls of the Galactic Council where decisions were made based on data and projections. None of them accounted for the human mind's ability to adapt, to overcome, to endure. Tomorrow, he would explore further. Tomorrow, he would prove again that survival wasn't about technology or luck. It was about willpower. And Elias Rourke had plenty of that. Elias emerged from the ice caves of Zyros 7 after 17 days. His body was gaunt, his skin pale from prolonged exposure to artificial light and freezing temperatures. But his eyes were sharp, alive with the knowledge that he had done what no one else had dared to attempt. The cold air outside felt different now, less oppressive, as if the planet itself had acknowledged his presence. He stood at the cave's mouth for a moment, letting the wind whip across his face, grounding himself in reality once more. He had survived, not just for a few hours, not just barely, but long enough to gather data, refine techniques, and prove beyond doubt that the ice caves were not the death sentence the Galactic Council had declared them to be. The return journey was slow. His muscles ached from weeks of strain. His boots were worn thin, and his emergency rations had been reduced to a handful of dried fungi and half a protein bar. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. He knew better than to rush. The final stretch of survival wasn't just physical, it was mental. One wrong move, one lapse in focus, and everything he had accomplished could be undone. As he reached the extraction point where his transport pod waited, Elias hesitated. He looked back at the caves, their entrance now just a dark slit against the icy landscape. He had lived inside that darkness for 17 days. He had built shelter from ice, fed himself from the cave's sparse offerings, and mapped its dangers with his own 2 hands. It had tested him in ways no simulation or training ever could, and it had changed him. Inside the pod, he activated the emergency beacon. A low hum filled the cabin as systems powered up, preparing for departure. He sat down slowly, securing himself into the harness. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion from the weight of what he had just done. The signal would reach the nearest relay station within minutes. From there, word would spread. The Galactic Council would hear. Scientists would question. Explorers would wonder. And somewhere, someone would read about his journey and think, maybe I could do that too. The thought made him smile. News of Elias Rourke's survival spread quickly. Within days, interstellar media outlets picked up the story, broadcasting grainy images of the extraction footage, quoting experts who debated whether the success was an anomaly or proof of something greater. The Galactic Council issued a cautious response, acknowledging his survival, while reiterating that the ice caves remained officially uninhabitable due to environmental hazards. But the narrative had already shifted. Independent researchers began reviewing Elias's recorded observations, analyzing the patterns he had identified, the oxygen fluctuations he had mapped, the sheltering techniques he had developed. Some called for further expeditions, arguing that if a single human could survive under primitive conditions, then with proper planning and equipment, temporary outposts might be feasible. Others saw deeper implications. If the ice caves of Zyro 7, a place deemed uninhabitable by advanced technology, could sustain human life through adaptation alone, what other worlds have been dismissed too soon? How many planets have been labeled dead zones simply because machines fail to operate there? Elias's journey had exposed a flaw in the Council's methodology. Their assessments relied on rigid parameters, on data collected by probes and drones that couldn't improvise or endure hardship. They measured habitability based on comfort thresholds, not survival potential. And in doing so, they had overlooked a fundamental truth. Humans weren't machines. They didn't need perfect environments to thrive. They needed resilience, ingenuity, the ability to adapt. That realization sparked a quiet revolution in planetary exploration. Some research groups began advocating for a new approach, one that incorporated human-led field testing alongside automated surveys. Others pushed the creation of specialized survival teams, trained to assess extreme environments firsthand, rather than relying solely on remote data. For the first time in decades, the conversation around colonization wasn't just about technology or infrastructure. It was about people. Elias returned to civilization to find himself an unwilling celebrity. Scientists wanted to interview him. Governments wanted reports. Private exploration companies offered contracts. He declined most of them. He wasn't interested in fame or funding. He had never set out to make history. He had only wanted to prove that survival was possible. Still, the impact of his journey was undeniable. His methods became case studies in survival training programs. His notes were archived by planetary research divisions. His name appeared in academic papers discussing the psychological and physiological adaptations required for extreme environments. He had become a symbol, not of recklessness, but of defiance, of human will. Some critics argued that his expedition was reckless, that encouraging others to follow his example could lead to unnecessary deaths. But Elias never claimed that what he did was easy. He never suggested that anyone should attempt it without preparation. What he had done was push a boundary that had been drawn too early, too hastily. And in doing so, he had forced the galaxy to reconsider what was truly possible. Months later, when asked why he had gone into the ice caves, Elias gave a simple answer: because we were told we couldn't. It was a sentiment that resonated deeply, not just with explorers, but with anyone who had ever been told something was impossible. His journey was more than a survival story. It was a reminder that limits are often imposed by those who have never tried. The ice caves of Zyros 7 remained dangerous, cold, unforgiving, but they were no longer unknown, no longer off limits. They were a challenge, and humanity had accepted, because sometimes all it takes is one person to walk into the darkness and refuse to turn back, and sometimes that one person changes everything.